This is The Other 51. I'm Brian, and this week, my guest is Dr. Galen Clavio. My guest this week is the person who I think I've talked to the most over the past 4 years, who's not my wife or my daughter. He is the author of a new book on social media and sports media. He is the host of a zillion podcasts, my co-host on The Flip Side. When we do it, Dr. Galen Clavio, welcome back to The Other 51.
Thank you, and I'm really sorry that you talked to me that much. That's not anything I would wish on anyone, including my wife.
I was going to say the same thing to you. And we're sorry about the flip side. I mean, it just kind of, you've got a new administrative gig. We're both teaching and trying to deal with life in a pandemic. So, I mean, not that we owe you guys an explanation, but I do feel kind of bad about it. I miss those chats.
I do too. I kind of think about it like I think about the way that the Rolling Stones or U2 handle albums now, where it's like once every 3 years there'll be a new album, and then it becomes once every 5 years, and then it's like once a decade. It's not like we're done, and we'll still tour. Like you'll still see us at Saratoga Performing Arts Center or something like that. But the albums have kind of slowed down a little bit, and maybe someday we'll kick them back up again for old time's sake.
The flip side is definitely on the State Fair concert tour circuit of podcasts. So, so I did want to ask. We were talking a little bit before we formally started recording here. We're recording this end of July. It'll come out early August, leading into an academic year. You both teach, and as I said, you're kind of in the administration and on that. And I'm wondering, as much as you're capable of talking about it, what is all this planning looking like from the administrative point of view? Because I've talked with people about what it's like teaching during the pandemic and dealing with all of this, but now kind of from the administrative side of it, what's this look like?
It's tough, because I think one of the things that I've learned in my experiences as if you start off as an assistant professor and you're doing your research and you're very much in your own little world, your own little area. As I've gone on throughout my career, this is year 14, I think, that I'm a full-time member of academia. There's so many other things that have to be taken into account administratively that you just don't think about when you're a kind of a ship of the line professor or assistant professor. You have to take a bunch of different factors into account, not just faculty, not just areas, but also students, also administration. And so with this particular situation, it's been rough because I think everybody has an opinion on the proper way to do things, the right way to do things, and a lot of times we make those decisions or we have those conceptualizations in mind, independent of financial ramifications or anything like that. But, when you have to think about all that stuff, it does change your opinion on things a bit. And so, I've really, as I've looked at how we try to approach the fall semester, I am very empathetic towards students who, don't, and parents who don't want to feel gypped out of a normal education. But I'm also sympathetic to the same groups of students and parents who don't want to be in a position where their health might be endangered. And the same goes for faculty. The same goes for staff. It's a really complicated situation. As I've told my students, this is essentially unprecedented in Western civilization, like this particular situation we find ourselves in. Mm-hmm. And so when I keep that in the back of my head, it makes the process a little bit easier to deal with because I know that, to a large degree, we're just doing the best we can and to some degree making it up as we go.
Mm-hmm. But it is so weird just to think about the different moving parts that go into putting together, just from the faculty perspective, just a single class and trying to move it online and to do it all online. And certainly everyone has different comforts with doing that. I think you and I have both taught online enough where it's, we recognize what the strengths and the weaknesses are of the platform. It is kind of interesting to me, and we'll get to your book in a few minutes here, but it is interesting to me how in looking at kind of the higher ed and focusing on college and higher ed. I think once you get down into elementary schools, like we were talking before we recorded, or even high schools, that's a different population with different learning needs and different social needs. So I get that there's a difference. But in higher ed, it really does feel like we have in so many ways privileged, I don't know if that's the right word, privileged this in-person experience, right? And I think in recent years especially, because that's how we stand out. That's kind of the advantage of college. It's not just you're learning skills. You're in a social environment. You're around professors. You're around facilities. All these kind of things in person. And I think when you take that away, I think we're in trouble. Like, we're at state school, so that makes it a little better. But I'm afraid for like our friends who are at smaller liberal arts colleges. You know, I went to a small liberal arts college for undergrad. I may have mentioned that once or twice on our numerous podcasts. but I worry about them. You know, financially existing on that. It's just such a. It's unprecedented, but also in a way I feel like it's kind of like newspapers in the 2000s. I picked the best fields to go into, but it is very much like accelerating, not the decline, but the exacerbating and accelerating the problems that are kind of built into the system.
It does to some degree, although I would respond to that with a couple of points. I think first, I think it's easy to conflate the predicted issues that many people have had with higher education's model and the current situation and be like, well, this highlights, how we've been mistaken in focusing on X, Y, or Z. And it's like, this is, as I said earlier, it's literally an unprecedented global pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen in a century. And the idea that any format of business or education was going to easily weather that storm was probably impossible.
Sure.
And so I do worry certainly about the implications for the smaller schools. And I think that in times like this, what you end up with is situations, much like in athletics, which is the topic of the flip side sometimes, where we talk about what goes on in sports. The first to perish are the ones that are the most reliant on immediate revenue,
right,
and have the least amount built up. And so I think in education, it's probably not that far off. But look, keep in mind, we've had past, purges essentially of smaller schools and smaller, areas of education as the market has shifted and changed. And I think that what will probably occur here is an acceleration of a reordering that was already taking place with those sorts of schools. And that doesn't make it any better. It doesn't make it any less difficult to watch occur. And I don't feel any less bad for the people that are directly involved in it. But I do think that if you're going to take the 10,000-foot view of the industry, I think there's a reason we privileged in-person communication and instruction and learning, because it really is still, I think, the best way of having people learn certain things. And it's also the way that we handle education in this country and in many other countries, where it's not just about learning,
right,
the stuff that's in a book. It's about experience. It's about social experience. It's about vocational experience. It is a different type of educational environment than it was maybe 100 years ago, but it occupies a very important place socially for, the 35-40% of the population, and that number tends to grow with every generation.
There aren't going to be college sports this year, right? I mean, we can just kind of let that one go.
I don't know. Here's the thing. 2 weeks ago, if you'd said there's not going to be in-person classes this semester, yes, or this fall, we would have said, yeah, of course not. That would be silly. And it sure looks like a lot of places are going to do it. Now, will those last? I'm not sure. But I really think, and this kind of goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning, it looks easy on its face to say, well, we're not going to have college sports, but there's so much budgetarily riding on having major college sports, having football and potentially having basketball, that that you could say, yeah, we're not going to have college sports in the fall, but that particular equation probably then relates to, well, we're just not going to have a whole bunch of individual college sports come spring, period.
Right.
Like maybe ever again. And again, this is the education problem on a little bit of a more micro scale. The athletics is so beholden to revenues coming in that I think it's going to take a couple of catastrophes in terms of public relations, or something much worse than that, for major college athletics to be willing to let go of playing sports in the fall. But there's a lot of people on Twitter who really seem to be pushing towards that idea of, just entirely hitting the reset button and not understanding the financial ramifications that will entail. And I understand certainly that, the idea that, hey, health is the most important thing. I absolutely agree with that. But that is a really tough call to make when not having football, for instance, for a Big Ten institution or a Big East institution not doing basketball might mean 6 or 7 or 8 sports just get wiped off of their athletic department roles because they wish they won't have enough money to pay people. And so that's why I'm not entirely willing to say that we're not going to have sports this fall. It probably would certainly be wise not to have sports this fall, and I think you're putting a lot of people in unnecessary jeopardy by doing so. But I also think that there's a counter argument to that, which is more kind of hard, cold numbers and financial based, which says, well, we're going to have to try to find a way to press on with it.
It's fine. Clay Travis says we're not going to die, so it's all fine.
Yeah, let's listen to that guy. That seems like that's a great idea.
So you mentioned Twitter, and that's a good segue into the main reason why I wanted to have you on this week was to talk about your new book, Social Media and Sports, with web resource. I want to make sure I get the web resource in there. Congratulations. I know this is one of the other reasons the flip side kind of has gone dark is aside from all your other gigs, you were cranking this book out. So congratulations on getting it done.
Thanks. It's first of all, I mean, thanks to Human Kinetics and to all the folks involved there with just trying to get the whole thing started. It took about a year to do, and it was one of those things where I knew I would write a textbook at some point, and this seemed like a good spot. But Drew Tyler from Human Kinetics was kind of the one that was like, "Hey, would you consider doing this?" And working with Amanda Ewing, my editor, throughout the course of the last really year plus has been an interesting experience and a really good one. And it is interesting because like the book was essentially wrapped up in probably late February, early March, right as the pandemic was happening. So it feels like a long time ago since the finishing touches were put on it, but it's really only been a few months.
So I know lots to talk about on this. So you've written, you've co-authored books before. I know you have a kind of sports journalism textbook. The name I can't remember, but one I do use in my classes.
Multimedia sports journalism.
That's the one. You've written book chapters. I know we've written at least one. Maybe I've lost track. We've written at least one book chapter. I think we may have written 2 or 3 together. So what was the biggest difference between that kind of experience, co-writing a book or writing chapters in a book, to this, where you're the solo author and it's all yours?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people, when they go the textbook route, they'll edit the volume essentially, and they'll solicit chapters from people. And that was certainly an option that was on the table with this. But I wanted to try doing it myself because I was just curious, how much of a workload that would be. But I also wanted it to have a consistent voice. I think, one of the issues with writing about something like this is that you really, in my opinion, need to have a singular perspective. And that isn't to say that there aren't other perspectives that are different, but it's hard to meld a holistic view of social media as it relates to sports media unless you've got somebody that you can work with who 100% is on the same page as you. And I mean, you and I are, we've done podcasts together and everything. We're cut from similar cloth. We don't have the same perspective on most things,
right?
It's like, so it was a really interesting challenge because it's a lot of words. I mean, I don't know. I forget what my word count was on my dissertation, but this ended up being about 92,000 words. And wow. And that's a shorter book. I mean, there are books that are certainly longer than that, but I think for me, it helped out a lot because it allowed me to really conceive of it as a more fully fleshed out intellectual approach to what's kind of a confusing topic sometimes. Because when I teach social media and sports, here at the media school at IU, I know that some of my students are prospective journalists who are planning on going and working in writing or television or whatever for media companies. Some of them are prospective social media specialists that are going to work for teams or work for leagues. And, it's this divide that normally is like, it's like, well, they're not people that are taking necessarily the same courses. And if they are, they're taking very different things out of them. And it's like, well, there's actually a central core of information and a central core of philosophy that both of those groups should probably be drawing from. And so that was the idea behind doing it by myself. The reason, I guess, just for the book in general, was that there haven't been a lot of textbooks specifically in this area. Jimmy Sanderson wrote one that was excellent very early on in the process of social media becoming a thing, but that was the early 2010s. And, you mentioned the web resource jokingly at the beginning. One of the things about doing this book was, let's try to get as many of the core concepts down in the text, and then let's have this web resource on Facebook or on Twitter or on whatever that I can update on a regular basis so that it stays relatively up to speed. Because from the moment that I started the book until the moment I finished, Twitter went from 140 character tweets to 280.
Oh, wow.
And TikTok went from being like the new hotness to like a Chinese spy algorithm. And all of these little podcasting became huge. And all of these things just kind of popped up that it's hard to do. I think it's hard to ask an author that's working with you, hey, go back and rewrite all of this because these things changed. And it's also hard when you're writing about something as topical and as timely as social media,
right,
to keep up with a like a core text. It's a lot easier to have it be something you can use in tandem with something that is more updatable.
Sure, absolutely. And I wanted to get into that a little bit too, because I was thinking about this, and like the challenge I think in writing for any kind of book format, especially with social media, is kind of like what you alluded to. Like it's an always evolving series, collection of platforms, right? It's this collection of media, the norms, the uses of which tend to change really quickly. And the book writing is so, like, you're writing it a year out. It's coming out months after you're done writing it, and so much can change. But I was thinking about this, and I'd love you to get your take on it, because it seems to me in a way that, like, aside from all the changes you literally just said, but it does seem that social media has kind of stabilized in a way, right? Like, I think early on it was the fear that you were going to have like 3 chapters on how to use MySpace as a sports reporter, and obviously that's the joke. But now it seems like kind of Twitter, like the big 3 of Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat have kind of all stabilized. Snapchat up and down, how useful it is. TikTok is like, there's always going to be like the new thing or the new Chinese spyware or a combination of the two. But it seems to me, I'd love to take on this, that like in a lot of ways social media has kind of like stabilized, and that opens up the opportunity to kind of write about it a little more, with a little more authority and a little more lasting authority.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because there's a whole chapter in the book that really tries to focus on things from that perspective. And essentially, I'm just going to read, this is the beginning of chapter 6, which is called The Technology Curve. And I'll quote myself here. When I first started studying social media, I used to get comments from article reviewers that would go something like this, quote, "Why are you wasting your time studying Facebook and Twitter? Everybody knows these networks are going to disappear in a year or two anyway and be replaced by something else," end quote. I
remember a certain panel at IACS in New York that was basically this, but please continue.
That mentality used to drive me crazy for 2 reasons. First, the first decade of the 2000s certainly had its fair share of failed social networks, and the demographics and user bases for networks like Facebook and Twitter so that they weren't going anywhere anytime soon. But second, and more importantly, Facebook and Twitter's network contained the building blocks for future online social communication. And even if the brand names changed, the process of people interacting with one another in an online space was worth studying. There were important clues from both practical and theoretical perspectives in the way people approach social media. We still see many of those same trends today. So it's essentially what you just said. And it's really kind of a core idea behind the book, is that, Facebook could get broken up by the government, or Twitter could collapse. Both of those are unlikely, but they could go away. But what they would be replaced by would be refined versions of what they currently offer. Mm-hmm. And you might repackage certain things. You mentioned Snapchat. Most of Snapchat's best ideas have been essentially commodified, parceled out, and reformulated into Instagram by Facebook. Whether it's the stories function or the animated GIFs or things like that. And there's only so much change that you're going to sustain in any sort of a media format as we start to find its parameters. And I think you could have probably made a similar argument about the early days of television as people tried to make about the early days of social media, and you would have been deadly wrong both times. So that's, it's a challenge. And I think that the key thing to remember with social media is that the important thing is what it does with the audience, what the audience can do with it, and the idea that it's the transference of information that's the important thing, and certainly the skin around that can change somewhat, but the core aspects aren't really all that different.
So how have you noticed, I'm going to get to the actual writing too in a few minutes and kind of that process, but how have you seen, you've been studying social media since before we met, so going on at least a decade now that I know of, and probably longer. How have you seen, specifically in the sports media world, how have you seen social media use evolve?
Well, gosh, I mean, I think the biggest change has been everybody starting to take it seriously after years of not taking it seriously. And whether you're talking about sports journalism or you're talking about the way that the teams and leagues have utilized it, I think the biggest difference was probably when those entities fully embraced social media. I would maybe argue in some cases over-embraced social media as their methodology for communicating with the public. I think for sports journalism, a lot of the early going was trying to use it as a conduit to get to the revenue drivers. So newspapers, even ESPN, would be like, we can't, don't break news on Twitter. Try to get them to the website. And then they largely gave up on that when they found that that was not how the technology worked. For sports teams, I think a lot, and especially athletes, like what it's done is completely shifted the paradigm in terms of how information gets spread and what you can do. One of the things that I talk about early on in the book is this idea that 25 years ago, you would have, I guess this is why sports information directors existed. This is why public relations officers existed, was, we need to compel the media in our communities to cover what we're doing as sports teams. And for some, that was really easy. For me, as one of my former jobs as a broadcaster and PR person for like a minor league hockey team in Memphis, Tennessee, kind of hard to get yourself into the commercial appeal unless there was nothing else going on that day. And now that job would be a lot easier because now I would have the ability to connect directly to audiences. I might not be able to do it at the same scale, but the ability of social media to largely democratize content production. And I think we're seeing that especially on the collegiate athletic level where there's money. That's been the biggest change for me. And I think that certainly on the journalism side, what's really been interesting, I think, is watching sports journalism fall into the trap of thinking Twitter is far more important than it actually is. And you and I have certainly talked about that on many occasions on our other podcast. But there's a lot of confirmation bias that takes place on a site like Twitter because just demographically, it doesn't represent that many people, at least not in the United States. But it's so readily available, and it does do certain things well that I think the expectation is it does a bunch of other things well. But that really isn't the case. What it ends up doing is, I think, giving a lot of publishers and a lot of reporters a false sense of who their audience is, what their audience thinks, and allows for a lot of tilting at windmills where maybe time might better be spent doing other things.
Can you, or in the book, do you pinpoint or can you think of like the moment or a moment when that switch flipped and either teams or journalists or both, maybe different for both, it may be the same, kind of started to realize social media's importance and power? I'm trying to think while listening to you, and I can't come up with any off the top of my head. Just curious if you can think of any.
I don't know that I specifically highlighted moments in the book that acted as those sorts of inflection points. I think it was a little more gradual, and I think that certainly I will say this from a sports journalism perspective. I think what occurred around the election of Donald Trump really changed the relationship to a large degree between ESPN and Twitter, for instance. because, ESPN has done a lot of things historically with social media where they're behind the scenes, they're leveraging it about as well as anybody in the space. But that was really the first time that social media became weaponized against ESPN on a broad scale, and on a scale that didn't necessarily have much to do with their core mission of theoretically being a sports media company. So that would be, I guess, one of the big things that I would think of there. The other area, though, I think, and this was more of a gradual thing, but the NBA figuring out how to leverage and to some degree weaponize Twitter in their favor over the course of like 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, where the NBA essentially took an entirely opposite approach to social media from the NFL, from Major League Baseball, from the NHL, where they really embraced the community that was there. They embraced video sharing. They embraced all of these things that these stuffier leagues with older audiences just didn't think was that important. And it didn't detract from the NBA's ability to, for instance, sign a big television contract. In fact, I think to some degree it actually enhanced it. But it definitely made it so that if you're looking for an example in the sports world, you could point to the NBA and you could say, wow, that's a league that not only learned how to coexist with social media, but steered into it to a large degree and made itself about the highlight, made itself, not in the Sports Center sense of the highlight, but in the House of Highlights sense of the highlight, and the buzz that would surround games and individual moments. And so, that I think probably is the best example I can give there. And then there's other global examples that you could point to also.
So 92,000 words. That is a lot of words.
I think that's, and I can't remember if that also includes the web materials or not.
Okay.
But yeah, it was a lot of words.
Okay, so how did you kind of come to? I know how you came to this topic, but in time, kind of organizing the book and kind of figuring out how long it's going to be, how it's going to do, and kind of process it out. I'm assuming there was, my knowledge and talking to people who've written books, you had a proposal and kind of laid it all out in that. But so how did you kind of work through, because this is, social media and sports, big potential topic, so big. How did you kind of work it down and organize it and kind of make it manageable to that point?
So the plan was, when I put that proposal together way back in, I guess this would have been December of 18, I worked on it for a couple of months, and I wasn't sure. I had some general ideas of how I wanted to try to approach it. And then I decided, after going through a couple of itinerations, that I really wanted to make it more holistic and really have that web resource as a floating resource, not just for the reader, but for me to be able to take a little bit of a broader and more conceptual view of things in the book itself.
Okay.
And so that allowed me to think about, all right, let me, with any subject like this, I think you have to start with an introduction of the topic and essentially frame what you're trying to say. And for me, that frame was based upon this idea of, all right, here's the rise of social media, and then here's the way that sports has utilized social media very broadly, and the way that journalism and professional media companies have utilized it very broadly. And essentially creating a it's not really a three-part Venn diagram, because all of these things are very interconnected with each other. But this idea that you've got social media as the meeting point, you've got sports entities on one side, you've got journalistic entities on the other side, and you've got these, shifting global audiences that continue to broaden things in ways that we just don't have a whole lot of experience with in terms of human communication. There's not really. I guess one of the big things I talked about earlier, it's like this is the first truly global scale communication set of media that we've had before.
Right.
And so from there, it was a matter of thinking about, okay, if I'm a person in 2020 who's a high school senior or a freshman or sophomore in college, and I don't really think about social media from the standpoint of anything other than the thing that I communicate on with my friends, which I think for a lot of our students, that's where they start. How would I try to explain to those people in a way that made sense, not just what social media is, and not what the individual networks are and what they do, but also how they apply, and what do you need to know to be successful if you want to consider a career in them. And so I outlined a couple of chapters early on that focused specifically on skills and tools. So understanding what sorts of softwares are utilized, what sorts of hardware is utilized, getting a better sense of, okay, what is the fact that there is a person that works for the Atlanta Hawks as their social media specialist. You might not even really think about it as a person. You're probably thinking about it as just this disembodied Twitter feed, or whoever's running the Instagram page. So understanding that, yes, that is a job. Here's what that job does. Here's what tools that person utilizes. And then there's a whole chapter in the book on the process of being creative on social media, and really taking that back down to its essence and understanding what it's all about to create content, to figure out what is funny or what is informative, what is not, and being able to compare and contrast that with things that are out there. Then there's a whole arc in the middle of the book that really talks about audiences on social media, the way that those audiences come together in a communal structure or lack thereof, and then the way that the technology fits together, all of those pieces. And then the last part of the book is really about how to apply some basic media theory and principles to utilizing social media, and then how all of these things broadly apply to what I call editorial content, which would be newspapers and television and web companies that are independent of sports, how all these things apply to what I call industry content, working for teams, working for leagues, working for athletes. And then to some degree, the last chapter is really a summation of all of those things, but also a discussion about some of the personality factors and the personal factors that affect people working in social media. Things like burnout, dealing with trolls, dealing with a lot of the issues that people who work in this and end up getting burned out on it very quickly have to deal with. And so, I wanted to try to strike a balance between going too deep into anything, but also, not going too shallow into anything. And certainly there's probably things I left out, and areas that I could have gone more into. But I felt on the whole, if I was trying to have someone who was tangentially or superficially interested in social media and sports, but really didn't know much about it, they'd be able to read this whole book and get a sense of where it came from, where it's at now, where it might be headed, and what you needed to do to actually make a career in it.
Now, I love that idea you said of kind of thinking as a high school senior or college freshman or sophomore, and what's useful to them, and thinking about audience is such a key thing that in academia we don't do very well, especially when you're writing research stuff because reasons. But I do think, but for a textbook, that's kind of what I wanted to ask you next was this idea of, writing a textbook versus a research article or, something like that in terms of tone and voice and what you present and just the actual writing of it. What was the biggest difference, challenge you found kind of going from one world to the other?
I didn't find it too challenging because I much prefer writing in the voice that I wrote in for the textbook than I do writing the research articles that I write.
Same here. Yeah.
It's the research articles, and it's funny because it doesn't have to be that way. I've read plenty of articles from the 60s, 70s, and 80s that are written by giants of the academic field and communication they're rich in their language usage, and they're funny at times, and they really make good points. And I kind of feel like, at least in our little corner of academia, a lot of the soul has been sucked out of academic writing, and it's very dry, it's very removed. I hope there aren't any editors out there listening to me as I say this, but I just, to me, it's like it's not a very enjoyable form of writing or form of reading. Right. And I knew that, particularly if I'm aiming this at college, underclass people, juniors and younger, that's a tough sell, and look, I've got enough experience as a podcaster, and that's essentially the voice I was trying to go for in writing the book. I would write these long chunks of text essentially in my speaking language, and would then go back and try to tweak things. And I mentioned Amanda Ewing, my editor. She did a great job of going through and highlighting where things were not clear or got a little bit off into the weeds. And I felt like that really improved the overall, the language that the book used. But generally speaking, like, to me, if I could write like this all the time, I would. And I, to some degree, wish academic writing was a lot more like that.
Right. So you've used a lot of textbooks throughout your teaching career. What's one thing that, as you were working on this one, that you hated or didn't like about most textbooks that maybe you tried to avoid or improve on in your own?
Well, with all due respect to the people that have written the textbooks that are out there before, a lot of them they're not that enjoyable to read, in my opinion. Like, they're very, I think, okay, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because, in writing college textbooks, I think there's almost too much that is predicated on trying to work theoretical items directly into the text.
Sure.
And that ends up, I think, creating a stilted read for a lot of people who really are just trying to figure out what the core concepts are and how they might apply. And, to some degree, I think by the time you write a textbook, you're a lot of times a little bit older in your career. You're not particularly, you're not always that current on how things get applied to a particular area. And look, it's a lot easier, frankly, to write a social media textbook than it is to write like a history textbook.
Sure.
Where you're very much tied to a 20 or 30 years earlier perspective on things. So a lot of the textbooks I've read, just they're either almost too basic and talking down to the audience, or they're obviously written by somebody that's in academia and is still primarily thinking along those lines. And I'm not saying I necessarily did much better, but I did consciously try to make it a little bit more engaging to younger audiences without necessarily talking down to them or acting like they had no clue about what I was talking about at all.
So I've asked you this when you were on the other 51, I don't know, 2 years ago. So you should know what's coming. Since I ask everybody on the podcast this, what's the best thing you've read lately?
Man, probably the registrar's report last week, because I noticed that several of our courses had made. So I would say that the best thing that I have, you're right, I should have actually anticipated this, and I entirely did not. But I will bravely venture forth here, and I'll say actually probably the best thing that I have read most recently is. Believe it or not, a biography of Meriwether Lewis and the Lewis and Clark expedition.
All right.
It's called Undaunted Courage. And this is a Stephen Ambrose book from several years ago. It's a really fascinating book to a large degree. It's if you've read Ambrose before, that particular writing style he's got. It has nothing to do with sports. It's just been a lot of fun because I think it's a really interesting tracing of a very unique circumstance, like an overlap of moment and person, or people, I guess, in this case. But I'm going to cheat a little bit here and say that one of the best things I've read lately is actually something that I'm listening to right now, which is the Mike Duncan's History of Rome podcast.
Okay.
Which, while a podcast is, and this is old, this is a decade old now, essentially, but Mike is still very active on Twitter. But the entire thing is written out, and he's essentially reading it on the podcast, which doesn't sound like the most entertaining set of circumstances, but as a Rome buff and a guy that is interested in the topic as a whole, I think Mike does an awesome job of consolidating sources, putting them together in an easy to understand format. And I mean, it's about 160-part podcast series, but I highly recommend it, and I highly recommend the book that he just published, I think a couple of years ago, called The Storm Before the Storm, which is essentially taking a certain part of that podcast and blowing it up into a full book.
Very cool. I'll have to. I don't know if I'll get to all 160 parts, especially since I'm not commuting until at least January. But
it's great for walking the dog because each of the episodes are about 18 to 25 minutes.
Oh, perfect, excellent. So I do have a recommendation for this week too. I went we went on vacation a couple weeks ago, so I went on like a 4 or 5 book bender where I didn't have to like be checking my email or be preparing courses or anything. And I read The Caregiver, which is a novel by Samuel Park. Came out 2 years ago. And unfortunately, the author Samuel Park passed away before the book came out of cancer. But it's a relatively short novel, but it's a beautifully written novel about a woman who escaped Brazil back in the 1980s and the political unrest there, and is working as a caregiver in Southern California, and kind of like her backstory on that. Just a lovely book. So nice,
great.
Yeah, nice little break from the usual sports / history / war stuff I usually end up reading. So that was good.
I'll have to put that on the list. My reading list is so hopelessly backlogged right now that it's embarrassing, frankly. And part of it is because I'm my 5-year-old has decided that we're going to spend every night for at least an hour playing Stardew Valley together.
Okay.
And which is a video game that came out about 5 years ago. Highly recommend it. It's very peaceful. If you like farming, tremendous game to be playing at this particular time. But that has cut into my reading time quite a bit as well. So that's made for some interesting compromises. But it's a good compromise overall.
Absolutely. My daughter is totally immersed in the Percy Jackson and the Olympians universe. She read all 5 books in about 2 weeks, maybe. Just plowed through them, and we actually had to institute a 1-week ban on moving on to the next series because it was literally all she talked about, which is, of course, amazing and wonderful. And there's a musical that's good, and there's a movie that's less good, but she's all in that world. So we had to say, okay, take a few days break, read something else, and then you can go on to the next series. So
seems wise.
It does. So when is the book officially out?
It's out now.
It is out now.
Excellent. It is out now. It just actually, I think they hit the publish button on it, 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
And I've got my paper copies, and the ebook is available, and it was written with an ebook in mind. So if you really want a paper copy, you can certainly buy one. But the ebook is probably the most easily accessible version.
So what does that mean? You wrote it with an ebook in mind?
Well, my philosophy on all things, as you know, is I'm not a big paper guy in general. My whole life has essentially been lived on the computer. Like I got my first computer when I was 6, and have been reading and doing things on the computer since then. So it's kind of weird because, most of the time when people write books, the biggest piece of gratification they have is when they can hold the physical copy in their hands. My biggest piece of gratification was when I opened up the PDF for the first time. And, I firmly understand that makes me kind of unusual, especially considering the other guests you normally have on this podcast. But when I was trying to put it together, I was trying to think about, all right, how would this play and how would it look within the confines of an e-reader or a PDF. We still designed it with pages in mind, and I think certainly the layout looks quote unquote better in physical format like that. But certainly from a length perspective and from the idea again of having a web resource where you're calling on documents that are online, it's no less of an experience there. Let's put it that way.
Well, I can honestly say you are the first person in recorded history to have been happy to open a PDF of anything.
I firmly am. I'm happy to steer into that particular side of things. So yeah.
Awesome, Galen. This has been awesome. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for listening to The Other 51. Show notes for this and all of our episodes can be found at sportsmediaguide.com by clicking on the Other 51 tab. If you like the show, please consider giving it a rating and a review, either at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help people find the show. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.